We turn now, though, to the next chapter in the career of the most famous Republican in America. Yesterday, Sarah Palin, the former half-term governor of Alaska, turned Republican vice presidential nominee, turned again, announcing her latest gig is as a paid contributor to the Fox News channel. The announcement was yesterday, and today she got to work.
There is an obvious disconnect between President Obama and the White House, what they are doing to our economy and what they are doing in terms of not allowing Americans to feel as safe as we had felt, and people finally saying, you know, this is not the representative form of government that we thought that we had voted in. After a year's time, people are saying, no, we want the White House, we want President Obama to hear from us. We want these common sense solutions with health care, with jobs, with the economy, with the war on terror to be implemented so we can get back on the right track.
So we can get back on the right track. We will have much more on the Sarah Palin debut in just a couple minutes coming up on the show. In terms of the substance of her critique, it should be noted that a week from tomorrow is the one-year anniversary of President Obama's inauguration. Republicans, including their new paid pundit-in-chief, have already started to use the one-year mark of this new presidency as a way to try to spin it as a failure. Over the course of the next week, we'll be able to judge exactly how good Republicans are now at framing things for the mainstream press. We'll be able to judge by what the president does and doesn't get credit for in look-backs at his first year. Take, for example, one of the more significant news stories of today. The U.S. Federal Reserve announcing that it made a $52 billion profit in 2009. Now, there's a number of ways to respond to a strange headline like this. One is to be outraged about it, to blame the Obama administration for the Fed's socialistic intervention in the banking system. Another way to look at it is to say, well, this big, confusing, politically unpopular thing that the government did with lots of taxpayer money worked out okay in some ways. We didn't have a second Great Depression. We still have a banking system, which wasn't a given a year or so ago. And by the way, we taxpayers just made $52 billion in profit for the Federal Reserve's part in this. Might be hard to accept that when you're here, but financial observers overseas are certainly taking note. The BBC reporting today, quote, "The figures suggest that U.S. taxpayers have so far gained money from the U.S. government's action in propping up the system." The news out of the Fed today is sort of a microcosm of what's happened with the economy during President Obama's first year. Yes, unemployment is still a huge problem, but if you want to talk jobs, here's the context. Here's what job losses looked like during the last year or so of the Bush administration. 3.6 million jobs lost in 13 months. Now, this is what's happened since President Obama took office. We're still losing jobs, but we're doing so at a much slower rate. Job losses are heading in the right direction. Steve Bannon first put this graph together at Washington Monthly. We've decided to keep it posted in our newsroom ever since our executive producer christened it the bikini graph. You want to see another bikini graph? Take a look at the stock market, specifically the Dow. Here's what President Obama inherited from the Bush administration. And here's what's happened during President Obama's first year. For all of the unpopularity of the bailouts and the scare the Tea Partiers' actions of the Fed and the Treasury Department, for all of the demagoguing and freaking out about the economy, the numbers look okay. They at least seem to have gotten a lot better under Mr. Obama. He seems to have turned things around. And in terms of legislative accomplishments, whether or not you like the policies this president has pursued, consider what moved from his to-do list to the done list in this president's first year. Not his first term, but just his first year. Less than a month after taking office, President Obama got a massive $787 billion stimulus package passed. Every mainstream economist in America says the stimulus worked to prevent a much deeper economic downturn. Even the right-wing think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, last week put out a report saying the stimulus worked. Even Mark Zandi, one of John McCain's economic advisors during the campaign against Obama, has been willing to admit publicly that the stimulus worked. Right around the same time, the president signed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, allowing people facing salary discrimination to seek justice in the courts. In March, he lifted an 8-year-old ban on embryonic stem cell research. In June, the House passed potentially transformative climate change legislation that Obama made one of the centerpieces of his campaign. In August, Congress confirmed President Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic on the Supreme Court. Waiting on deck is what promises to be the most comprehensive package of financial regulation reforms since the days of FDR. And then, of course, there's the granddaddy of them all, health reform. President Obama on the verge of achieving something that's eluded nearly every Democratic president who has taken it up before him. Jacob Weisberg, writing in Slate late last year, said of health reform, quote, "For the federal government to take responsibility for health coverage will be a transformation of the American social contract and the single biggest change in government's role since the New Deal. If Obama governs for 4 or 8 years and accomplishes nothing else, he may be judged the most consequential domestic president since LBJ." And speaking of LBJ, every year Congressional Quarterly tracks what they call the presidential success rate, how frequently presidents get their wish from Congress when they clearly express what it is they want Congress to do. The gold standard of recent presidents has been the legendary congressional arm twister Lyndon Johnson. On congressional votes in which LBJ made his preference for the outcome clear, Congress did what he wanted 93% of the time. That was in 1965. This past year, Barack Obama has topped that. He's broken the record. In 2009, on votes where President Obama took a clear position, Congress voted his way 96.7% of the time. That's a record. Congressional Quarterly sums up their findings by saying, quote, "Barack Obama's success rate was the highest, not only for the first year of any presidency, but for any year since Congressional Quarterly began this study 56 years ago." Now, this president notably has picked his battles. He has deferred action on promises like repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell and closing Guantanamo. The fate of Afghanistan and even Iraq, the American role in those places, those are open questions. Fighting terrorism is a treadmill that no one expects anyone to have the luxury of getting off anytime soon. But as we close in on the end of year 1 of the Obama presidency, on the precipice of health reform after 60 years of trying, having prevented the Second Great Depression with the politically unpopular but frankly effective bailouts and stimulus, with the first Hispanic justice nominee in place on the Supreme Court, just watch the reception for the Republican spin in this next week about this president's first year. Just watch the reception to the Republican spin that this president has been such a disappointment. Just watch. Joining us now is NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Mr. Beschloss, it is great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
Great, thanks. Empirically, whether or not you like Obama's policies, but from a pure quantitative perspective in terms of what this president has done, how does President Obama's first year stack up against previous presidencies?
Really is the equal of Franklin Roosevelt in his first year, LBJ in 1965, or Ronald Reagan in 1981. You know, Obama last year, or 2 years ago during the campaign, kept on saying, "I want to be a transforming president," like Roosevelt, like Johnson, like Reagan. And the breadth of the kind of things that he's done, you were absolutely right to talk about them, I think suggests that that's what he's going to be.
In terms of the challenges that he faced, the president talked about, has even almost joked about the fact that nobody could have ever guessed that Iraq would almost be considered a back burner issue for this presidency,
Absolutely.
that he'd be dealing with the economy. Can you give us some historical context for what challenges he was handed?
It's almost unique in the last century. When FDR came in 1933, we were in a terrible Great Depression, but in terms of foreign policy, the world was fairly quiet, and Roosevelt could spend his first term basically concentrating on the economy. If you look at a case, for instance, like LBJ coming in 1963, had to deal with the death of John Kennedy, but again, the world was relatively quiet. He was able to concentrate on his domestic program. In contrast, look at Obama coming in just a year ago. We were teetering, as you said, on the brink of another Great Depression. We had 2 wars, a struggle with terrorism. This is someone who had to deal with things on all sorts of fronts and engaged with every single one of them.
On the issue of how he has been perceived, we titled this segment "Common Wisdom Fail" because it seems like there is a maybe solidifying common wisdom that this first year hasn't been a success. And again, not trying to take this empirically in terms of judgments about his policies,
Sure.
but in terms of what he has done, we should address the issue of his approval ratings. If he's at 50%, which is what he was at in the latest Gallup poll, or somewhat above and below that, how does that compare to other presidents and being a consequential president having to deal with a split American public?
When you do things that are controversial, like health care, your numbers are going to go down because, people will not like some of the things about that program. Bill Clinton's toughest time during his first term was when he and Hillary tried to do health care. It was immensely unpopular, wasn't even taken up by Congress. That's when his numbers really began to go down, just before he lost Congress, both houses, 1994. And on top of that, in Obama's case, he's got this enormous jobless rate, which I'm still getting over the bikini graph, Rachel. But Franklin Roosevelt never had one of those. I think he would have liked it. But, despite that, the jobless number is high. It could even possibly, God forbid, be higher, later on this year through some scenarios. Until that goes down, he's not going to get better in terms of numbers. Ronald Reagan was in a very deep recession beginning of 1983. His numbers were 41%, yet 2 years later, Reagan won that enormous landslide, 49 states.
NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss helping us keep things in context as always. Thank you very much for your time tonight.
My pleasure.